Support for this project is provided by Touchstone Home Products, maker of the Sideline Fireplace. To learn more about the electric fireplace I'm using in this project and to see other models, visit touchstonehomeproducts.com. And Mohawk Finishing Products. From lacquer to fill sticks, Mohawk has all your finishing needs. Hey, what's up guys? Well, this is a pretty big project with a ton of tips and tricks in it. It's a double-sided cabinet. The back is an open bookcase, and on the front you can see I've got the 50-inch Sideline Fireplace by Touchstone Home Products. This is a safe and smokeless alternative to a wood-burning fireplace. It looks cool, gives off heat, and I think it's going to be a great addition to the art studio. Let's go down into the shop and get to work. I'm going to get started on this project by first making all the face frames. I'll cross-cut the boards to a rough length, about an inch or two heavy. Then over at the table saw, I'll rip the boards to width. Now I'll square off one side of all the boards, set up a stop block, and cut all the parts to their final length. I'm building this cabinet, or most of the cabinet, out of Sapele, which is a hard wood, and I'm making the face frames using pocket hole screws. Because Sapele is a hardwood, a dense, very hard and dense wood, I'm using the fine threaded pocket hole screws. For softer woods like poplar or Douglas fir, I use the coarse screws. With the face frames built, I'm ready to move on to the legs, and I'm building the legs out of what's commonly referred to as 8/4. This board happens to measure about 1 7/8 thick. I'll get started by running it over the joiner and then ripping the board to width at 1 7/8 and then cross-cutting the legs to a rough length. Now I'll run the legs through the drum sander, removing any blade marks and sanding the legs down to an exact 1 3/4 square. Again, I'm using pocket hole screws to attach the face frames to the legs, and I've cut a piece of scrap wood at 1/2 inch. I'm using that as a spacer to attach the face frames to the legs with a 1/2 inch setback. For the flat panels, I'm using 1/2 inch cherry plywood. It just happens that I had a few small pieces of 1/2 inch cherry plywood and didn't want to buy a full sheet of Sapele. I've combined Sapele and cherry on other projects, and I think they go well together. I'm attaching the cherry plywood to the back of the face frame with a little wood glue and 1-inch nails in the nail gun. I'm kind of figuring out this project as I go, and I decided to build a bookcase behind the fireplace. I'll start by adding an 1 3/4 rail attached to the legs at the bottom with the same 1/2 inch setback. Now I'll use the table saw to rip poplar cleats at 1 inch. After cutting them to length, I'll pre-drill and countersink the cleats and attach them to the inside of the rails with wood glue and 1 1/4 screws. I used a scrap piece of 3/4 inch plywood as a spacer as I attached the cleat, keeping the top of the plywood flush with the top of the rail. When I attached the cleat to the side of the cabinet, I kept the top of the cleat flush with the cleats at the front and back of the cabinet, and then tacked the cleat in place with 1¼ inch nails before screwing the cleat to the cabinet with 1¼ inch screws. For the bottom of the cabinet, I'm using 3/4 inch birch plywood. I'll first rip it to width and then cut it to length using the crosscut sled on the table saw. Then I'll add a little wood glue to the top of the cleat, drop it in position, and nail it off with 1.5 inch nails in the nail gun. Okay, well you can see that I've just about finished with the cabinet. I'll still want to add a little molding to the inside of the flat panel. Maybe a little molding at the bottom here, but I'm pretty close. The next step is to build a bookcase, and that's going to fit on the inside back of the cabinet. I'm going to build the bookcase and finish it separately from the cabinet. I'm basically looking at this project as 4 main parts. I've got the bookcase, the cabinet, the top, and the fireplace. I'll build and finish everything and then put all the parts together. I'm building the bookcase out of 3/4 inch birch plywood, and I'll get started by ripping and cross-cutting the parts to size. I like to use the miter saw to rough cut the parts, and then I use my crosscut sled on the table saw and cut all the parts to their final length. Here I'm using a shelf divider to mark the height of the center shelf. I'll use a stick that measures 3/8 of an inch and hold it at the line I just made. Now I'll trace a line against the stick, and this is where I'll need to pre-drill and countersink holes for the screws. For the shelf divider, I'm laminating 2 pieces of 3/4 inch birch plywood together. I'll use a little wood glue and I'll tack the parts in place, and that will keep them from moving around during the glue up. Now I'm ready to build the bookcase, and I like to tack the parts in place first just to keep them from moving around, and then I'll come back with an 1 5/8 inch screw. I'll pre-drill and countersink holes through the shelf to attach the shelf divider, and I'll fill these holes later with wooden plugs. Next, I'll make the face frame that will cover the edge of the plywood. I'm making the face frame the exact opening of the width of the cabinet, which is 53¼ inches. I've made the cabinet or the bookcase measure only 53 1/8 inch wide. I did this so when I install the bookcase in the cabinet, I'll have a tight fit where the face frame meets the leg. So in other words, if that sounds a little confusing, the face frame is going to hang over the side of the bookcase by 1/16 of an inch on each side. I'm sure a few guys out there are a little concerned or annoyed at the fact that I'm nailing through the face frame, and I'm not too worried about it. I'm going to fill the nail holes with color match fill sticks from Mohawk, and you'll never see them. I'm not going to attach the bookcase to the cabinet until after it's sanded, stained, and finished, but I just wanted to make sure it fit, and that looks pretty good. For the flat panels, I'm making 3/8 cove molding. I posted a separate video on this part of the project last week, and I'll have a link in the description if you want to check it out. Making molding is not very difficult, and it's actually a lot of fun. I enjoy making molding, and it can be very useful because often you don't need very much molding, and it's just easier to make the molding than to have to run out and buy it. I decided to dress up the bottom of the cabinet with a small piece of bead molding. I made the molding on the table saw. It's very easy to make, and I've made a few videos on how to make bead molding. I'll put a link in the description. And it's kind of amazing how this little piece of molding really finishes off the cabinet. I'm using the router to put a small chamfer at the bottom of the legs. I think the chamfer looks nice, but it also helps to reduce splintering or chipping when moving the piece around. I built the top of the cabinet out of 3 solid boards. Again, I'm using Sapele. And I've got a separate video on building the top. I wanted to focus on how to use a biscuit joiner. To see that video, click on the link in the description. I let the glue set up overnight, and now I'm ready to cut the top to size. First, I'll rip it to width, and then I'll use my crosscut sled and cut the top to length. I'm using the same cove bit in my router to cut a profile into the bottom of the top. By removing the material in 2 passes, you reduce the risk of tear out and end up with a much cleaner cut. After giving all the parts a good sanding, I'm finally ready for the finish. For a stain, I'm using medium brown walnut by Mohawk Finishing Products. This is an oil-based stain, and I'll apply the stain with a foam brush, let it soak in for a minute, and then remove the stain with a clean rag, rubbing in the direction of the grain. After letting the stain dry for a few hours, I'm ready to spray lacquer. The lacquer I'm using is called Finisher's Choice by Mohawk Finishing Products. I like to use 3 coats of lacquer, sanding in between coats with 320 sandpaper. After finishing the cabinet, my son Michael gave me a hand carrying all the parts upstairs into the art studio. The first step was to attach the 1/2-inch plywood back, and for this I'm using 1 1/4 screws. And then I pre-drilled holes in the sides of the bookcase to attach the bookcase to the cabinet. Here I'm using 1 5/8" screws with a finish washer to attach the bookcase to the cabinet. I'm using 4 2-inch screws at the bottom of the cabinet and screwing into the cabinet divider. Now I'll use a color match fill stick from Mohawk Finishing Products to fill the nail holes in the face frame. To attach the top, I use 3 screws through the plywood bookcase, and then in the front of the cabinet, I use wooden clips that fit into slots made with the biscuit joiner. The wooden clips will allow the top to expand and contract. Placing a weight on the top will keep the top from moving around while I attach it to the cabinet. To install the fireplace, first I'll remove the glass cover and place it face down on top of the cabinet. And then I'll thread the plug through the hole that I drilled and install the fireplace unit into the cabinet. I've centered the fireplace in the cabinet, and now I'm pre-drilling holes for the screws. Now I'll take the plastic tray and place it above the LED lights. Before installing the glass cover, you can choose between crystals or a faux fire log. Now that I've got everything set, I can install the glass cover and secure it in place with 2 locking screws at each side. Okay, well, I'm really happy with the way this turned out. I think it's a great addition to the art studio. And eventually I will be moving the cabinet out into the middle of the room, and the cabinet's going to act as a room divider. The back of the cabinet where the bookcase is will face the back of the barn. That's eventually going to be my new office. And the fireplace will face the front of the barn, which is kind of the lounge area, the hangout place, and it's a place where I'll meet with clients and show my artwork. So I'm really happy with this. If you want to build this cabinet, I will have free plans. You'll be able to find them on my website. And a huge thank you to Touchstone Home Products and Mohawk Finishing Products for supporting my channel. As always, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.